So yeah, that happened. We tried to do the live stream and it didn't work. It messed up really badly, and now we're recording off the air so that this can be shown a little bit later. Anna, how do you feel about that?
Ugh, they're trying to silence us. That's all I'm trying to say. They're trying to silence the 14-year-old Maoists. They're trying to kill us. They are trying to get us off. We are the most revolutionary force on the internet. That's why they're trying to silence us.
Well, this is it. The Maoists in the West, obviously, we represent like the biggest threat to the global hegemony, and we are at the vanguard of the woke agenda that we were discussing last week. And
Biden is a Maoist. Like, exactly.
Maoist Biden. so what's been going on with you?
Oh God. Okay. So I am working my job as the worker that I am. My feet hurt because I have to stand all the time at my job. Other than that, I've been good. I've been rewatching childhood movies. I watched Spirit recently. Have you seen Spirit?
No, isn't that like an anti-colonial thing? There's like an anti-colonial subtext or something like that.
Yes, basically. So like it was my favorite movie when I was like 3, and I think it probably like had an effect on like my view, but it's like about a horse in like the west of the US, right? And it's about manifest destiny, right? So like he gets captured, like the horse, by kind of like settlers, right? That are trying to break him so they can prove that they can tame the Wild West or whatever, right? And at the same time, they capture and they imprison like an indigenous man whose name is like Little Creek, right? And then but they both escape, right? And the story is about how like they both earned like and fought for their freedom. So it's basically like resistance to like manifest destiny, like very subtly with like really not great music. I'm gonna be honest, like the music is really cringy because you can tell they made it for the movie. So it's like it's like never gonna give it up. No, like it's you can't tame me. I'm free. It's so good. But yeah,
Disney
so I watched that
pretty good though.
Yeah. I also watched Aladdin. That's an interesting movie.
Did you see Akeem's video on Aladdin?
Yes.
Can never look at it the same way.
He's spitting because that movie is oof. I was like, okay. But it has made me think because I don't know, the genie and stuff, that made me sad. Robin Williams being dead and stuff.
Oh yeah.
But if you had 3 wishes, if you could be granted anything, Paul, what would it be? 3 wishes.
3 wishes. Okay, so
doesn't have to be political, it can be anything.
So let's do both. We can do like non-political and then we can do a new political because it's kind of difficult. You know, like on one, it's like I really want a job. I really wish I had a job and I didn't get fucking turned away from every fucking interview that I got. I would really like that, but no. Come on, you meet a genie. Shit, that's not what I want. No, okay. So non-political. I think I would really like for my insomnia not to affect me so badly. I would like to be able to sleep like a half normal person. The really big thing that I would like, not to bring down the mood, but I would really like to have my dad back. He passed away a few years back, and he was just a really good friend, really great person, great mentor, and I just really like to have him back. So non-politically, that's it. I think too that those are the only 2 non-political things that I could really ask for. Politically, Mr. Genie, Mr. Stalin Genie, I would of course ask for fully automated luxury gay space communism, absolute abolition of all forms of oppression, just all of them, everything from like patriarchy, colonialism, everything, all that shit just needs to be gone straight away.
Hyperophobia,
which some people here know a thing or 2 about and have perhaps engaged in
at it. I can't
at some points or another. Crit session upcoming. No.
Lo siento.
Speaking of hypernophobia, my second wish will be the end of Britain. No more Britain. We've had enough of Britain.
Yeah.
No more Turf Island. We are breaking
into the ocean.
Well, I tell you what, they can redeem themselves if they assimilate to Celtic. We can have a union of Celtic Soviet Socialist republics. That's what we can have. We can liberate them. I don't know what we're going to do with England or, East Ireland, whatever you want to call it. But definitely Scotland and Wales can join, and we'll see. We'll see if the English fuck around. Maybe we'll let them in. We'll see about that.
We'll see. We'll see if they adapt.
We'll see how
We'll
they
see
fit
if they
in.
get civilized. Yes.
We'll see if we can civilize them into unleashing the Celts within. But we'll see what we can do about that. And
I'm a huge proponent of Irish imperialism. I'm gonna be honest. I think it's a great idea.
it's the logical solution. Just keep.
I don't know why we're
expanding.
laughing. I'm so serious. Like,
yeah. Well, I mean, legitimately, I mean that's the way forward. Social imperialism, anyway. That's what we're gonna do. Yeah. Under a red flag, I think is the important thing. And last, I don't know if you've seen this. Did you see the news recently talking about a Mediterranean Ireland? Did you hear that?
No.
This is the
Mediterranean
darkest
Ireland.
Shit. Yeah, this is like the darkest shit. So, as you might have heard of a thing called climate catastrophe and global warming and all of the awful things that are happening.
Yes.
Well, seeing as we've lived through, COVID and these mass death events, we're just kind of accepting them. These are just things that are happening now. We're just going to have to deal with it. Well, now they're doing that with climate catastrophe. Now the Irish media is encouraging us to look on the bright side of global catastrophe and climate disaster, because by 2027 Ireland is apparently going to have Mediterranean style weather, so I can finally get a nice tan and not be such a pasty bastard my entire life, and we can go to the beach and have nice times. It's not going to be raining all the time. We're not going to get 4 seasons in a day. It's just going to be nice and sunny, and we can enjoy life.
That's so awesome. Oh my god, Irish bourgeoisie won't have to go to Malaga anymore and destroy our cities in the south.
Yeah, no more Irish imperialism in what's now known as the Spanish state.
Actually, it's not. I mean, it's not Irish people as much as like English people and French and German people. Oh my god, we should place a travel ban on them.
The lads, like the 20-year-old lads and people on like stag do's and shit like that. Yeah, like groups like 20 lads just getting fucked up. And
every single year there's news in Spain about how some like British dudes like jumping off like what's it called? Oh, balconies, like into like pools in like southern Spain and shit like that, or just like harassing people and like being, oh my god. One time I was walking, I was like in a restaurant, okay, and I was with my family. I was like 10, okay, and then this British guy started like snapping at me. Ooh. And I was like, what? And he was like, another drink, love. And I was like, oh, I don't work here. And then he was like, oh, you know English? And I'm like, yeah, like just get out of my face, get out of my lens.
Good on you, but
LOL. Anyway, give Gibraltar back. Okay, so
yeah, big way, in a big way. But I want that Mediterranean Ireland without the global climate catastrophe. So Jeannie, please give us Mediterranean Ireland. Do not give us.
I'll give you Gibraltar. I'll give you Gibraltar.
We can liberate
we can compromise
into an Irish Celtic socialist republic. Yeah, we can definitely make that happen. What about you? What are your Jeannie wishes?
For me, okay, my non-political ones, I want to be able to understand, speak, and write every language. That's one of them. I don't know if that counts as 3. I hope it's just 1, okay? So that'd be so cool. I want to, like, know what people are saying all the time. And I also want to learn, like, Tagalog and Catalan because, like, I know Spanish, I know English, right? And I want to learn these other 2 languages as well. And I want to learn every single language. And I want to be able to sing, like, this is the second one. Like, you know how flamenco dancers sing? That's called, like, cante, of, like, bulerías, basically. And I, like, grew up listening to it, and I've always wanted to be like that. Like, you will catch me in my car yelling to, like, this, like, music, like, literally, like, Camarón de la Isla, like, even Rosalía, I don't care. Like, you know, I just, like, but I can't do that shit. Like, I'm not good, so that's upsetting. And then other than that, I think being able to dance very well, because apart from the fact that, like, I am Spanish and Filipino, so I should have this covered, right? I was born with 2 left feet. I've always been a nerd, like, you know, like, I've just never, like, been that great. So I want to, like, if I could dance every dance well, then I would kill it. Politically, I don't know. Maybe I would like the National Democratic Movement to succeed, and I want to like an establishment of some kind of like union of socialist Iberian republics, right? But other than that, I guess, I mean, if I could just be like, one of my wishes just be like every Nazi dropped, that would be fine with me. Honestly, that would be one of my goals. But yeah. Only other thing I was going to say, due to the climate catastrophe stuff, I'm actually in the zone right now where like the smoke from like the Canadian wildfires is like genuinely affecting my area. So I have not been able to leave. Well, I mean, like, except to go to work and stuff like that, but like I've not been able to leave my house. And like recently it's gotten better, but literally yesterday, I think like the measurement is, but it's at 169, and that's like bad. Like it was so bad. Like we looked outside and I couldn't see like the like houses and apartments in front of like the street across. It was bad. Like it was so LOL rip Mediterranean Ireland and I guess ghosty East Coast of the United States. Isn't like what's that place that's like it's always foggy? Yeah.
Silent Hill. Yeah.
Multiple places. Yeah. Silent Hill. Oh, LOL. Yeah, Silent Hill, East Coast.
Yeah, well, I mean, if it's foggy there, at least you can come to Ireland in 2027 and it's going to be Mediterranean weather. It's going to be beautiful. It's going to be no
That's
climate
true.
catastrophe because we'll have gotten in touch with the genie and everything's going to be fun. So,
Perfect.
Nazis will
All
have
right.
been redacted of natural causes.
I'm
And
excited.
yeah, everything's going to be good. Everything is going
I'm
to
really
be
bringing
fun.
my Mediterranean climate with me to Ireland this summer. It's gonna be so great.
Yep, looking forward to that. Definitely. So, welcome to Marxism today with your hosts, the one and only notorious Casamang Anna, and yours truly, Paul Connolly. Today we're going to be
Woo!
discussing
Oh.
the excitement, the excitement for me. I've never heard fanfare from me, so that's nice.
Oh.
Yeah, so today we're going to be discussing the blockade on Cuba, its history, its purpose, and why it needs to be opposed by all principled socialists, communists, and even just regular progressives. After this, we're going to get into some interesting discussion about AES, actually existing socialism, and how we should approach these matters. So that's going to be interesting. We would have done a Q&A with the audience if this was live at the end. That could have been a lot of fun as well. We had some good people in the live chat. But as we're recording this, I'm afraid I don't think that's going to be possible. But we will have a little live chat. We will have comments below. So feel free to ask some questions there and we'll try to answer them in due course.
We can answer in the next stream, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. If the internet starts working again by that point, which I don't really think that's going to happen. I'm not too optimistic that the internet's going to sort itself out for this. I feel like this stream was a little bit, there was something funky going on with this stream. I don't know. Even the little Google Doc that we have to put our little notes on for what we're going to talk about today, it kept crashing on me for like the last 3 days. As soon as I put in the title, did that happen to you?
I couldn't. You remember that I couldn't like write on it or
You couldn't
something?
edit
Like
it.
it wouldn't let me edit it.
I
And it
went in
worked.
and it was like it was set to be able to be edited by everybody, but it wasn't. But yeah, as soon as I put in that title, the title of the video here, which is Biden upholds genocidal Cuban blockade, things just got a little bit strange internet wise. So
Sleepy Joe was wide awake for that one, huh?
yeah, he's not fucking around. He is not fucking around on this one. Jesus Christ. No, he was offended.
LOL.
He was tuning into this. Yeah. Anyway, I'm excited to announce that Marxism today, moving forward, is going to be moving in the direction of becoming a worker cooperative, with Anna here becoming a core part of the project. So really excited about that. Anna, I don't know if you want to do like some fanfare to that.
I'm excited to work with you, and I'm excited to like grow this as kind of like a media presence in a way that like both like facilitates political education, creates space for like revolutionary voices, as well as functions in a way that is not exploitative to like our labor as much, as well as like facilitates our ability to collaborate as comrades and as friends. So that's all I got to say.
Yeah, definitely. It's going to be really, really cool. And I really like what you mentioned there about uplifting revolutionary voices, because that's one of the things that we're going to be trying to do here on the stream. You know, we're going to be having regular guests on the show moving forwards, particularly people who are going to be knowledgeable on various topics, and hopefully they'll be able to lend their expertise to the show. You know, for example, today we're talking about Cuba. I would really like in the future to be able to have episodes where, you know, maybe we would have someone on to talk about that, maybe like some ambassadors for Cuba, or, you know, other representatives who'd be able to speak on behalf of the country and really just provide deeper insights that, you know, I wouldn't be able to give, and I'm not sure if you'd be able to give, but I'm sure that they would probably have some deeper insights that they'd be able to contribute, and we could all learn from, you know. And aside from that, we are also looking into making a podcast version of these streams, which is kind of almost what we're doing here right now, accidentally. We hadn't intended on this being like a podcast. This was meant to be a live stream, but we will be doing podcasts versions of these, and we will be uploading them to various podcast services. We need to sort out our audio. We need to sort out the video. There's a few different things we're going to do to make that happen before we can actually launch that fully, but we are definitely moving in that direction. So if you're not able to catch the videos live, you want to listen, you know, on your way to work, if you're traveling, whatever, you know, we're going to make that happen as well. You know, obviously that's not going to include like the Q&A sections at the end, but certainly the main sections of the streams, which will then be converted into podcasts. So there's exciting times ahead, and lots to look forward to.
By the way, in order to make this happen and to deliver like high quality content to you, we have set up a GoFundMe to help us get the necessary equipment to step up our game to make a more professional quality show. So this includes better cameras, lighting equipment. Lighting equipment.
Lightning, Zeus.
We need lightning. Zeus, Thor. We need Thor on stage because he's going to be our other member of the worker co-op. But we need internet connection equipment and like more things. So, yeah, for sure. If you like what we're doing here, you want to see it grow into a serious media outlet, something along the lines of like Novara Media, but with a more explicitly scientific socialist outlook, then consider tossing a euro, a pound, a dollar, a Canadian dollar, a peso, I don't know, to the GoFundMe. Alternatively, consider supporting us on Patreon to help us take this to the next level. All Patreon support from here on out is divided equally between me and Paul, and the same goes for super chats in the live chat box, which is not the case this time, but
I will say though,
live,
when we go live, that will be the case. There's also, I think there's a comment you can do, like a little there's like a thanks button underneath the videos. It's like a little love heart that says thanks, and you can just drop like, you know, €1 or €2, as you said, like peso, a dollar, a Canadian dollar, a European dollar. I don't know, whatever dollars you got.
A duck,
you can talk, a duck. You can send some yarn, some linen, all that good Marxist shit to us. And yeah,
send us a cow or two.
Send us a couple of cows, and hopefully we can turn this into a proper media outlet moving forwards, and we can step up our game. So yeah, lots to look forward to. Really excited about this. I'm really excited to have Anna on board, and yeah, I hope you guys are excited too. It's a real step forward for Marxism today, and I'm looking forward to a more collective future rather than the kind of individualistic, personality-driven past, which has been there before, you know?
Even though your personality is awesome.
Irish people can't take compliments. You know we can't do that. That's like an insult. Can you not just call me a prick? Just call me a prick or a dumb bastard or something.
Why do you take, oh my God. Take a compliment.
We don't know how. We are so self-deprecating. That's all we know how to do. We can't. I think it's part of colonialism, man. I think that that's part of the ideology of colonialism. Like, Connolly used to say that
get out of that British mindset, okay, Paul?
Legit. James Connolly wrote about this. He said that Irish people are born with apologies in mouth as a result of this shit. We're always saying sorry. It's always sorry for everything. Someone bumps into you when you're walking down the road. You're gonna see this when you come to Dublin. You'll bump into someone else and they're going to say sorry to you for you bumping into them. You know, it's like, why are we doing this? But there's just like this inbuilt, I don't know.
I'm just going to start bumping into people purposely.
Just randomly, yeah. Oh, there you go. No. Spanish state imperialism. But how do you feel about me even talking about the Spanish state? There's a lot of people who live in the territory of the Spanish state who really, really do not like it. I know you've mentioned like your home.
I mean,
how do you feel about it?
I don't like the Spanish monarchy. And I don't think it's like legitimate. That's all I'm gonna say to not get too controversial, because like I just don't, I think that as it exists right now, it's kind of like a remnant of Francoism, and also like it's it represents what the Castilian crown initially set out to build. So, and I'm not a big fan. So that's all I gotta say about that one. But yeah,
Real Republican errors.
but when it comes to, but I get so nationalistic though when I'm in the United States and someone says something about Spain. I get
Yeah.
so nationalistic.
Yeah, it's
I'm
like
just like
if I'm abroad and someone says shit about Ireland, I'm just like, don't you fucking dare. Especially if they're English. And they usually are.
yeah. Literally, if someone hears like, yeah, like Spaniards are like lazy, like I become Francisco Franco. I'm just like okay, there's this one song that I forgot the exact first words, but like every single time someone says something bad about Spain, it starts playing in my head. It's like the most like Spain is the best country in the world song kind of thing. It's called Y Viva España by like Manuel Escobar, right? Manuel Escobar. I don't know. I'm gonna get yelled at by a Spaniard in the comments. That's gonna be like, que no, que se llama no sé qué. I don't know. Okay, no importa. But like it's such a good song. It's stuck in my head all of the time. It's like, entre flores y alegría nació mi España, la tierra del amor. And like that song starts playing immediately when an American says something like, yeah, I went to Spain. It was like actually not that great. Or like like I'm like ¿Qué dijiste? ¿Qué dijiste? De la patria. No, but anyway. Yeah.
No, that's cool. I would actually really like to discuss Spain with you at some point. I think we should definitely do a
Yeah.
stream or like a pod, like actually discussing Spain and diving into it. And there's a lot of questions that people have about it, specifically with regard to like national liberation struggles within the Spanish territory, the question of where Spain sits in relation to imperialism and the imperialist system. Because there's different positions on that. Some people say that it's more like semi-colonized. Some people say it's an imperialist state in and of itself. And I'd be very interested to dive into that and discuss these matters with you at some point. But today, we are going to be talking about Cuba. We'll start by doing a brief history of the US embargo of Cuba. So, Anna, what is it and why does it exist?
I feel pressure now that you said that. I didn't before. Okay, so after the Cuban Revolution deposed Batista and they nationalized US-owned Cuban oil refineries, the US placed an embargo on all exports except food and medicine to Cuba in 1960, right? The year 1960. And then 2 years later, they expanded this embargo to include virtually all goods, including food and medicine, right? And it has remained that way since. So while devastating from the start, as it blocked Cuban families from going to the island and like reuniting with their Cuban American families and stuff like that, and seeing their relatives or receiving remittances from them, right? The Cuban Revolution was initially better off. And during this embargo, during like the existence of a socialist bloc and the USSR, due to their allyship to them, because they had more food, they were more medicine secure, they weren't completely isolated from the world trade, and the Cuban people had a better quality of life all around, right? But after the illegal dissolution of the USSR and the fall of the socialist bloc, the embargo was even more devastating. It had more devastating consequences. So infrastructure, for example, came to a screeching halt, right? Food was scarce and needed to be rationed. The medical supplies in hospitals still are in desperate need of updating. And these essentials for life have been effectively blocked from reaching Cuba by the United States. The United States has used this blockade to force the Cuban government to open up for-profit industries in order for them to lift certain embargoes, like as in like, okay, well, if you open up your tourism to us for a little bit, if you open up these like hotels for us, like, and are capitalists, like we'll lift a couple things, right? Like really strangling them and forcing them to do this, as well as cause misery on the Cuban populace. So the majority of the world to this day seems to be against this blockade. and understand its horrifying consequences and how like it primarily affects the Cuban people. Even the United Nations General Assembly, for example, has passed a resolution every year since 1992 demanding that the end of el bloqueo, right, on Cuba. But the United States continues to suffocate the Cuban people to this day. And every single time this resolution is passed, the United States and Israel vote against it. They're the only two countries that do that. So yeah, that's the brief history of this. It's something that has been going on for over 50 years. And it's something that continues to cause immense suffering onto the Cuban people. Paul, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I really liked, no, I didn't like, but I think it was very vivid how you describe it as strangling Cuba. I mean, it's often been described as economic asphyxiation. It is a
Yeah.
genocidal embargo. This is intentionally killing people, and it's been this way since the start. This isn't an accident. It's not like they were just a little bit goofy. They thought, okay, well, we'll just put some, economic, embargoes on them, and nobody's really going to get hurt. Everything's going to be okay. We're just going to put a little bit of pressure on them. It's fine. No.
Yeah.
They have been clear since the start about their intentions. There was the 1960 Mallory memo from the U.S. State Department, and they declared the most messed up stuff in that. Let me put this up on the screen so people can actually see this. This document has been declassified for quite some time, and I'll just read out some parts from it that'll hopefully give people a feel and a taste for what the U.S. was actually trying to achieve with this embargo and just how brazen and open they were with their intentions. So, here we can see the decline and fall of Castro. Salient considerations respecting the life of the present government of Cuba are, and this is in 1960 again, 1. The majority of Cubans support Castro. The lowest estimate that they'd seen is 50%. So 50% support, and they wanted to overthrow this. Freedom and democracy, yeah. Very interesting. The second point, yeah, it is insane. The second point, they said there is no effective political opposition. 3. Fidel Castro and other members of the Cuban government espouse or condone communist influence, which I think is pretty interesting because at this time, Castro hadn't. He'd actually explicitly distanced himself from communism. He hadn't started bringing that up. He hadn't started declaring himself a Marxist-Leninist or any of that. So it is quite interesting that they got in there beforehand with these Red Scare tactics. Number 4, communist influence is pervading the government and the body politic at an amazingly fast rate. 5, militant opposition to Castro from without Cuba would only serve his and the communist cause. This is particularly interesting because this is 1960. As we know, just 1 year later, they had evidently ignored this particular note, this particular directive, because, of course, the Bay of Pigs invasion occurred then. The failed military might put down of the Cuban Revolution. It failed miserably, So that was like that's the one part that they didn't follow up on from this Mallory document here. 6, the only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. So they're committing to bringing about economic dissatisfaction and hardship. If the above are accepted or cannot be successfully countered, it follows that every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba. If such a policy is adopted, it should be the result of a positive decision which would call forth a line of action which, while as adroit and inconspicuous as possible, makes the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. So there you have it. The US is openly saying that they want to decrease monetary and real wages. They want to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of the government. Again, they want this to happen as though it's a grassroots movement. They want this to happen as though it wasn't happening.
Like a color revolution. Yeah.
Exactly.
Like
it's very much, it's laying the foundation for those color revolutions, which we now associate with the National Endowment for Democracy since Reagan's time, Pretty intense. What do you think about that? I'll read some more explanations now. I'll get into it a little bit more in a moment, but I'm not sure if you had any thoughts on that.
It's just it's laid out so clearly. here, and people like this is something that has been admitted, and this is a declassified document. This is word for word coming out of the mouths of the US State Department. Like they're very clearly saying, we know this is a revolution the majority of people support. We know that militant opposition to it will be, like not effective. So we are outwardly going to try and starve these people out and make their life miserable and make them die, right? Like of either not getting the medical attention that they need because we've placed sanctions on their like medicine, their import of medicine and other medical supplies. We're going to starve them out. Like it's very clear that they want the suffering of the Cuban people. Like this is official US state policy. And that's really shocking, but at the same time, it really isn't, right? That's why we have to, like, not just in the case of Cuba, but like everywhere else that the US kind of like imposes these sanctions on, for example, like in Iran, like we have to like realize like this is the main reason why. This has been their justification and their reasoning behind it, like forever. Yeah, I'm just, I knew this, but reading it out loud, it's crazy.
Yeah.
Like,
No, it really is crazy. And I'll just put that document up again on screen for people to see, like it's small. So you can see it again, classified file, signed off, again, 1960. And, you might not think that, you might think, okay, maybe you're sick and you think, okay, that's not so bad. That's not so bad. It is that bad. Fuck you. But they got worse. That's 1960. In 1962, this is after the Bay of Pigs, they got a lot worse. So I'm going to put this up on the screen and I'm going to read this out. They became a lot more explicit in what they were doing following that Bay of Pigs invasion. They tried the brute force approach, and now they had to revert to the more insidious long-term economic policies. So from the U.S. state programs review by the Chief of Operations of Operation Mongoose, Lansdale in 1962. And this is Washington, January 18, 1962. I'll just read the first couple of parts here because it couldn't be clearer what they were intending here. And there's some even worse parts in this, by the way. So pay attention here and it'll blow your mind. So the Cuba Project. 1. Objective. The US objective is to help the Cubans overthrow the communist regime from within Cuba, again, from within Cuba, and institute a new government with which the United States can live in peace. Very peaceful to overthrow someone supported by the majority. Now get this, right?
We cannot live in peace unless we have complete control over the island and their resources, of which we can live in peace. So we need a puppet government there. If not, we cannot live in peace. We cannot be peaceful towards a people that want control over their own means of production. Absolutely not. We cannot have that. We cannot be peaceful with people that have an anti-colonial, that have an anti-fascist government. Not at all. Anyway,
no
LOL.
The largest economy in the world just can't handle it. They couldn't deal with this. This was out of necessity.
They can't handle it with this small little island is threatening their entire existence. As the largest economy in the world, as the richest country in the world. Bro, we gotta play something else. Are you serious? That's crazy.
Wait till you see the explanation that they expanded upon that. And again, I'm just gonna read one short paragraph here. 2. The concept of operation. Basically, the operation is to bring about the revolt of the Cuban people. The revolt will overthrow the communist regime and institute a new government with which the United States can live in peace. The revolt requires a strongly motivated political action movement established within Cuba to generate the revolt, to give direction towards the objects, and to capitalize on the climactic moments. Pay attention to this next part. It's really, really insane. The political actions will be assisted by economic warfare to induce failure of the communist regime to supply Cuba's economic needs. That's one thing. Next thing, psychological operations to turn the people's resentment increasingly against the regime, so psychological warfare. And next, military type groups, so paramilitaries, military type groups to give the popular movement an action arm for sabotage and armed resistance in support of political objectives. So thoughts on that response to that?
I'm gonna throw up. Like, what the fuck?
Psychological warfare. That's something else. Just
They oh my
openly.
god, they're just like, yeah,
It's just
let's make people
propaganda.
suffer. Let's psychologically like abused and like them. Let's make them go insane and lose like their livelihoods. Let's make them lose their food, huh? Let's take away their needs. I think this will be a good idea. That way we can have the sugar there. It doesn't matter that we as the capitalist imperialist class already have the monopoly of sugar in this world. We have to have the one from that island because we're greedy and stupid and we have to have control over every single thing. Lovely.
Freedom and democracy. Truly
Democracy.
respecting the
Yes.
freedom of all peoples. The freedom for whom? The freedom for the capitalist imperialists to
Yeah.
exploit whoever they want, even if it's in a government that is, as they admitted themselves, supported by the majority of the people. So that's incredible that they just openly sought to manipulate the people and turn them against the new government. I
can't.
can never. I just can't believe that. I can't believe how openly they speak about this shit. And people still,
I know.
you still have these dipshits trying to, say, oh, well, is the embargo really that bad? Yes, it's that fucking
Yeah,
bad.
I have people like in my classes be like, well, the embargo isn't the problem. What? Like, it's like, no, like it's because the Cuban government is not like supplying people with their economic needs. Like the embargo is barely doing anything, and it's like the Cuban government that's not redistributing the stuff. And it's like, oh, so now we like centralization. That's very interesting. Secondly, that's not even true. Okay. Anyway, I'm gonna let you continue with your thing, but
No.
like it's
You
just, oh
that's such a good point because I mean, like they literally say right here that they're engaged in economic warfare to induce failure of the communist regime to supply Cuba's economic
yeah,
needs. Like they
yeah.
say this,
So
that
like,
this is what they're setting
yeah.
out to do.
Exactly. And like literally they caused such a huge crisis, especially after the fall of like the socialist bloc, where like the first refugees like were mostly like reactionaries and stuff like that, right? That were like fleeing the consequences of their actions. But the majority of people that leave Cuba now, right? They're people that like literally have to go because there's no food, there's no opportunities there, and this can all be linked to the el bloqueo, right? Like directly, as like we were discussing just now. So like it's created a huge refugee crisis, and luckily because they're Cuban refugees, like they do get a little bit better treatment than other like refugees because they come from like an enemy country, but still they really don't. There's a bunch of undocumented Cubans here in like the United States that are like, like in the land of opportunity, they're also suffering, right? Like without these economic sanctions and like this like really rich country, right? But like their displacement is a direct effect of like this embargo, right? That like is suffocating Cuba. And it just makes me so mad, like when people talk about this, especially like political science students that like, like the liberal war hawks or whatever, they're just like, no, it's like we just are against it because we're against lifting the embargo because the embargo is the only one that's like promoting democracy in Cuba. Like literally,
Jesus
I've heard
Christ.
people say those words. It's insane.
We all have our criticisms of Cuba, whatever, this or that or the other. Okay, we don't like that. Okay, there was 3 days of mourning when Franco died in Spain or whatever. Okay,
That's
we
true.
don't like
Yeah.
that. Okay, we don't like that.
Big
Fair enough.
L.
There's
Yeah.
little criticisms, whatever. Jesus Christ, it has the best democracy in the world. It literally has the most democratic system in the entire fucking world. You get elected as a representative, you work as like independents, and you have the same salary, the same wage that you had beforehand. That fundamentally
Yeah.
changes the nature of public servants, people who serve the people, they have regular votes at all levels, local, then up to regional, to national levels. It's an
Yeah,
incredibly
not like
democratic
these,
system.
yeah, not like these like progressive Dems that were like, I am working class and I'm running, and then after they run, they like get lobbied by lobbyists, and all of a sudden they live in a
Exactly.
$1 million house. Like, how did that happen? That's crazy. Oh, why are you rolling back like the stuff that you talked about? I thought you said Medicare for all. Now you're doing more affordable Medicare for some. What is that about? Why did you change your position? LOL,
Hmm.
democracy. We love living in a democracy.
No, you're right. It fundamentally changes the class position of those who get involved. Even if you're a socialist who runs for office in these systems in, advanced capitalist countries, you're going to get a salary that's probably like 4 times as high as the salary of a
Yeah.
normal worker. And so your
Yeah.
class interests then shift to being, if not petty bourgeois or bourgeois, at least labor aristocratic. And so,
Yeah.
are you speaking then on behalf of the working class and oppressed masses?
No.
The
Yeah. And
material
I
basis
will say,
changes.
I to pull the numbers out on this one, congressmen and women have a salary of $250,000 per year, right?
Wow.
But more than half of them are millionaires. And they didn't start out as millionaires, right? So like, and like, that's not to say that the other ones aren't also like better off and making more money than 250, but because the vast majority of them are, right? They're taking those pay cuts and stuff like that, but like half of them are millionaires, right? That fundamentally affects like the class interests of like who like the people in office are, right? Like apart from the fact this is already a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, right? So like if you're a person that's not a bourgeoisie that enters this, you will become one, right? But in this system that in Cuba, you won't, right? You will remain the same. You will receive the same salary. And I mean, I think that's pretty good. I think that's pretty based. I'm not gonna lie. I will
Yep.
give credit where credit is due. That is very
Credits to
based.
you. Definitely,
Yeah.
definitely. It's definitely it's definitely the closest thing to a workers' democracy in the world, in my opinion, anyway.
Yeah.
With these embargoes, there always needs to be like justifying ideologies. You have right wingers, and you alluded to this a little bit earlier, who try to say, "Oh, it's not so bad. It's not so bad."
Hmm.
The right wingers will claim that the embargo doesn't hurt Cuban civilians. It's only going after the government. And one of the things that they really point to, which I think is quite interesting and extremely cynical, is that it supposedly allows food, medicine, and medical supplies to pass through without any restrictions, which this is nonsense. This is absolute bullshit, as anyone who's been paying
Yeah.
attention over the course of, particularly over the pandemic, when we think about medical supplies. Because the reality is that if a product contains 10% or more of American created contents, then it needs to get a license from the US to be exported to Cuba. Now, this creates enormous amounts of red tape and bureaucracy to get these items to Cuba, because most of the producers simply aren't willing to do this, as it's too time consuming and cumbersome. They'd rather just trade with another country. Like, why would they go through, spending months and months trying to get approval to send this shit to Cuba when they could just send it to, I don't know, Dominican Republic or anywhere else that's more friendly and amenable to their interests.
Yeah.
And the material result of this is that this causes huge amounts of death. There's massive shortages in medical equipment, and this leads to huge amounts of easily preventable deaths. There's been a big problem with regard to syringes, particularly during the pandemic. Cuba has developed five extremely effective vaccines for COVID.
Yeah.
But this US created syringe shortage means that there was a significant delay in administering them, which of course directly caused unnecessary suffering and death. I mean, Cuba's done amazingly, despite all of this. In spite of all of this, Cuba has handled the pandemic incredibly well. And, they're exporting doctors all over the world. So, they've been killing it in terms of their pandemic response.
Yeah, Cuban doctors are definitely like famed for how like amazing they are and effective they are with the little supplies that they have, right? Like Cuban doctors have been like at the front lines, like helping and like healing. Revolutionaries have been sent to, like, for example, after Chernobyl, they had a huge like impact in helping like the survivors of Chernobyl. They were deployed to like South Africa. They have been deployed to Angola. Like the Cuban doctors have been out there doing the good stuff, for sure. And I know a bunch of people that they have been during this like syringe like crisis that's been going on, to, for lack of a better word, crisis of syringes. They have been kind of like trying to get syringes into Cuba, like during like their trips to Cuba and stuff like that. And sometimes U.S. Border Patrol, if they find syringes in your luggage, they take them out, or medical supplies. They take them out, right? Like, and they don't let you bring it into Cuba. And it's like, this could be like someone that has like is bringing it for their family or something like that. And like the Border Patrol, like sometimes they'll let him in, sometimes they really won't, right? Like, and like this might be like medicine that's like life-saving for their family, like, or necessary, like an EpiPen or something like that, right? Like for someone who has like allergies to like peanuts or whatever, like that's something that's like life or death, right? But you know, they take that shit too sometimes. So yeah, it's really inhumane.
Yeah. Yeah. Inhumane just describes the entire situation. I mean, what is this? How many years now? 60, 63 years since I started this.
Yeah.
And there's no reason. There's just no fucking reason for this to continue. Even,
Yeah.
even like right wingers, even Cuban right wingers make the argument that there's no basis for this
Yeah.
anymore. There's no ideological justification for it. There's no practical justification for it. I mean, it's a different world.
Yeah.
You know, it's not like the Cuban Missile Crisis situation. It's not like they've got connections to the Soviets and that's presenting like a security risk for the US in some way, shape, or another, or whatever it might be. Whatever justification they tried to come up with before, that doesn't exist anymore. You know, that's not an issue. You know, unless people are going to say like, oh, well, China or some
for
shit
example,
like that. But
yeah, I have like the majority of Cuban Americans that I've spoken to, like just like so many like Americans and stuff like that, or just like people in general, yes, they're reactionary. Okay. A lot of people, like I would say more than other groups in the United States, are very anti-communist. The majority that I've spoken to, and I'm talking about working class Cubans, right? They at least think that the embargo should be like less strict, at least, right? Because like they see like the way that it affected them when they like and why they had to go to like the United States, right? Or they have family that's there that's like suffering because of this embargo. I mean, like I can only provide that anecdotal like stuff, right? But like the reality is that like it Cuban Americans may have different opinions, but the majority opinion in Cuba, when you talk to any Cuban in Cuba that talks about this stuff, they know that the issue is the embargo. And people pass that off as like believing state propaganda, right? And I think that's really interesting because like people in Congress and stuff like that like try to counter this and say like, oh, like people in Cuba are brainwashed, it's a regime, so like you can't listen to what they're saying and stuff like that. They have people advising them that don't know shit either. Like for example, I went and I worked at Latin American Foreign Policy forum recently in April, I think is when it was. And the day before the forum, we went and we lobbied, right? And one of the things we lobbied on, like in Congress, right, is to lift the embargo, right? Like, so we went to the office of, I think her name is Maria Elvira Salazar, okay? And we went there with a bunch of Cuban Americans. We went there with Solidarity Allies. We went there even with believe her name is Liz Olivia Fernandez. She's like the host of Belly of the Beast. Okay. And we went there to talk to a bunch of Congress people. We went into Salazar's office. Okay. She wasn't there, but her foreign policy advisor on Cuba was there, right? We talked to them and they were very hostile towards our demands, like talking about, oh yeah, well, like Cuba is not doing this because they're not giving their people the necessary like things for them to survive, like it's the Cuban government's fault and stuff like that. And so we asked him, have you ever been to Cuba? And he said no.
no shit.
I was like, have you ever spoken to a Cuban? Right. And he said no, right? He's never been to Cuba. He's talking about I'm fighting for the democracy of the people in Cuba. The majority of people in Cuba like want this, whatever. And there's Cubans in that room with us being like, that's not true. That's never been true. Like the majority of us have been telling you that like you have to lift this embargo, okay? Like it's suffocating us, okay? There are people, for example, like they were even bringing up like right-wing arguments, right? Like this embargo is not helping like people who want to create small businesses in Havana and stuff like that because like you don't have like this connection there. You're not letting the Cuban middle class grow or whatever, right? Like even these like right-wing arguments. And so yeah, and we also brought up the fact that like he's talking about like we're imposing these sanctions because we want to enforce democracy. There are many countries that we are allied with that are not democratic, and we're not imposing sanctions on them, right? And it's specifically affecting the people of Cuba. He kept saying that it doesn't affect the people of Cuba. There's people there in that room telling him is primarily affecting the people of Cuba, and the Cuban government has been redirecting the supplies, the scarce supplies that they can have, to serve their people, right? But this guy was not understanding that at all, right? And he, at least when we left, he looked like he was like curious about it, right? But like you have to think about the fact that like people who are so-called experts on foreign policy when it comes to the question of Cuba, even them, they're not unaware they're doing this for profit or whatever. But he, for example, seemed surprised at what we were saying, right? Like he seemed like he was like, what? Because he'd never been there. But he's the one who's telling this representative, Salazar, right, how to vote on Cuba, because this is what's happening in Cuba. This is what happened in Cuba. This man doesn't know what's happening in Cuba. Right? Wow. He doesn't know. He's just listening to the demands of a very small amount of people, the majority of which are not Cuban or were born in the United States, were never born in Cuba. So that's just, it's so disheartening, I think.
Some cool fellow once said, no investigation, no right to speak, but yeah. Anyway. Yeah, but no, I think it's especially interesting hitting them with like right-wing arguments, just being like, what about the small and medium enterprises? You know, Cuba opened up in 2021 and they want to expand their business. They want to grow capitalism to get more freedom and democracy. Even making that argument, they're just like, wait, what? We're meant to be the ones to defend that shit.
Short circuit. I can't.
How do I deal? Yeah. Because they can't access, like websites and shit like that. They can't access the resources that they need to build their businesses and shit.
Because the United States places an internet embargo on Cuba as well, so they don't let them use the internet. I've had friends that went to Cuba, for like whatever, like to do some educational trips and stuff like that, and they can't use their phone for shit there because the United States also places the embargo on internet access. Like,
Jesus,
LOL.
freedom and democracy.
Yeah, for real.
The same people who think that you can bring freedom and democracy to Cuba by overthrowing the person who they acknowledged had the majority of support, minimum 50% support in 1960 by the Cuban people. Yeah. So, interesting definitions of freedom and democracy that we're getting here. That's all I'll say. Interesting definitions.
Interessante.
Yeah.
Lenin said something about democracy for the slave owners. I don't know.
Yeah, same as it's always been. Same as it's always been. Yeah. So maybe we'll get into this question of what's happened now under Biden and, what's changed, if anything's changed, since Trump's crackdown on Cuba. Do you want to talk about this? I've got a lot to say about this. Do you want to jump in first, or do you want me to dive into this one?
Sure. So, the background to this is that Obama had lifted a lot of like the sanctions imposed on Cuba in about, I think, 2015, right? And that was huge national news. They had restored full diplomatic relationships with Cuba, released Cubans in prison in the US, and so on and like so forth. Okay. And life in Cuba began to be a little bit better. If you watch this documentary that's called Cuba and the Cameraman, that goes throughout, like, it's this guy that came back every 10 years to Cuba, right? You can see the difference from like the early 2000s to 2016 or something like that, right? Of like how the quality of life improved. So that's like unironically based like foreign relation between the US and Cuba, with like kind of like the added like nuance that like a lot of this had to go like hand in hand with like the Cuban government like taking on some austerity measures, which was definitely not good. But like the bottom line is that Obama did a really good job in like opening the country up. It was like a huge like media thing. Like, I remember Conan O'Brien went to Cuba because of this. Like, I remember like listening to news about this, right? And then Trump came to office and Trump reversed everything. So it was literally maybe it wasn't even that long, because he got into office in 2000. He was elected in 2016. He got into office in 2017. So he reversed everything. That was 2 years, only 2 years of that being lifted a little bit. Okay. So it was a huge reversal, and people were very upset about that, especially Cuban Americans, right? Because they had better access, like under Obama and all that stuff, right? I mean, you can talk about this more as well, but like basically the thing is that Biden ran on the promise that he would go back to the Obama era policy on Cuba, right? And that he would reverse what Trump had like undone, basically. And that was a huge kind of like campaign thing that like Biden promised. And it so turns out that Biden is a liar. But I'll hand it off to Paul now to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that one really hits hard because of all the arguments that people were putting forward to vote for Biden over Trump in the last election, most of them I was just like, nah, it's not gonna make that much of a difference. Nah, this is just electoral bullshit. It's not really gonna change that much. The one argument that people put forward that made me like scratch my head and say, maybe, was specifically about normalizing relations again with Cuba, knowing the effect that this would have on the oppressed nations on the third world and how this would materially improve the living conditions for the people of Cuba. That was the one thing I could have said, okay, if you want to vote for Biden based on bringing back Obama's policies there, okay, I get it, fair enough. And then
there's a lot of Latino socialists and stuff like that were like really like considering or did like try to like did vote and tried to convince other people to vote like for like Biden, because like, you know, not only that, but like, you know, like other policy positions that he had that were more kind of like pro-immigrant and stuff like that, or like he proposed that were going to be, he promised, as well as like, you know, like the Cuba situation also specifically for Latino socialists was like a really important like point. But yeah.
Yeah, no, it was really it's been really fucked up that what happened, you know. So after being removed from the U.S. State Department's quote state sponsor of terrorism or SST list in 2015 under Obama, Trump, of course, added Cuba to this list once more. Very interesting time on the 12th of January 2021, just 8 days before Biden would come to take office. Very interesting timing how he did that, you know. And the justification that he used to put them on this SST list was that Cuba, get this, Cuba is a state that supports terrorism for participating in peace negotiations, not terrorism, peace negotiations between the ELN, the National Liberation Army, and the Colombian government. So, I mean, just that right there should be setting off all kinds of alarm bells, you know, but very interesting anyway. The Colombian government had called for the extradition of certain peace negotiators who are in Cuba. However, for Cuba, extraditing peace negotiators would have meant violating the protocol that it had signed with the Colombian government, the ELN, and other guarantor countries. Cuba reaffirmed its commitment to the peace negotiations, again peace, not terrorism, asserting that it would act in strict compliance with the peace protocols, and it refused to extradite the negotiators. And because they refused to extradite these negotiators, the US is claiming that Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism for its commitment to peace. So yeah, that's a thing. That apparently that is the criteria for a state sponsor of terrorism, a state that facilitates peace. Yeah, and it gets worse. It gets way worse. By the way, it gets way worse because this isn't just like a hangover. You know, okay, Biden inherited this, but he didn't, you know, enact it. It gets worse. As of August 2022, with the election of the center-left Gustavo Petro to presidency in Colombia, the extradition orders for the ELN peace negotiators have been suspended. So, the US's supposed current basis for designating Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, failure to comply with an extradition order for peace negotiations, or peace negotiators, excuse me, that no longer even exists. That's not even a thing anymore. Colombia doesn't even want that anymore. So there's no excuse. There's no extradition order. It doesn't exist. And yet, as of May 2023, Biden's administration has reaffirmed its commitment to keep Cuba on this list for the vague accusation that Cuba is not cooperating fully against terrorism. Meanwhile, it's actively trying to bring about peace. Okay, so I'm not sure if you had any thoughts
What
on
does
that,
that
but
even mean? What does that even mean? It's just like, what are they even saying? They're not helping out when it comes to terrorism. It's like, you have us under embargo. What are you talking about?
and just the
What
US
is
saying that,
what?
like the US,
Yeah,
how many
yeah.
assassination? Well, over 600 assassination
It was like,
attempts on Fidel.
what country did Osama bin Laden come out in a newspaper like in the 90s as like a freedom fighter? Who was that?
It's like,
What were you doing? But anyway,
yeah, I mean, that's
yeah,
it. Like
it's
the
insane.
US is the state sponsor of terrorist activity. It's them. They are the terrorist country. That is the terrorist
Yeah,
state, terrorizing the entire world. You know, it's wild
yeah,
that they're
it's
pulling this
insane.
shit.
And not only that, like, not only has like Biden kept the state sponsor of terrorism thing with that like flimsy ass like justification that they got there, but I mean, pueblo, but like he added them onto a list of nations of special concern regarding religious freedom, which what? Like,
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
like the Catholic
It's,
Church is skyrocketing in Cuba, by the way, at the moment. Like they're really building at the moment. Like religious freedom has been is stronger now than it's probably ever been. So
literally it's because like an American Pentecostal came to like Cuba and was like, I feel oppressed by the Cuban government because I was trying to have a Pentecostal meeting and they said no, or something vague like that. Literally not even like literally nothing happened. Like this man's dramatic and they were like, oh, see, we are having like literally what are you talking about, bro? Of course, Cuba as like a revolutionary government, I wouldn't expect them to have a very good relationship with the Catholic Church, and I would probably be like upset if they did. But at the same time, they actually like it's pretty neutral, like
yeah,
all things considered. Like it's not like Cuban Catholics are fine. Like, trust me on this. Like, literally, even like people part of like the revolutionary government of Cuba are like firm believers in like Catholicism, and they practice and they like go through all what's it called, the holidays and stuff like that. Like, they do shit right, and it's just kind of like it doesn't make any sense. Also, like interesting that Cuba is put under a list of countries of special concern regarding religious freedom, but not the UK. I don't know, like not other countries that are like um legitimately targeting, for example, like religions and like religious minorities. None of the countries in Eastern Europe right now that are passing Holocaust denial and obfuscation legislation are on these special concerns over religious freedom bullshit, right? Like, none of these countries that are passing all these Islamophobic policies or like anti-immigrant policies directly, specifically at Muslim refugees, none of these countries have special concerns attached to them about religious freedom. None of, like, for example, like in Saudi Arabia, either the UAE, or there's a bunch of Filipino Catholics there that are suffering under these regimes as well. Like, it's not hitting. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
doesn't add
Not
up.
Egypt either, right? Not Egypt either, with like their persecution of the Coptic, like Egyptian population. These people are on there. Well, I don't know. I don't know who's on the list, but I severely doubt. Okay. But Cuba is for some reason, right? Like, for what reason? Because they have to find something else, another justification for why they're placing this embargo on Cuba. It's bullshit, honestly. But
It
yeah.
is. It's such bullshit, and just like the consequence of these things, like the real material consequence of these. Like, okay, we can talk about these as like philosophical matters. We can say, oh, in principle, this is awful because look at the double standards here. Look at the U.S. being
Yeah,
buddy
that's true.
buddy with Saudi Arabia and this that. So this is a clear conflict of interest, a clear contradiction, and your
Yeah.
principles are all over the place. But no, like there's real material negative impacts from all of these things. Like, to get back to the SSTs, I mean, being back on that lists, Cuban individuals are suffering massively as a result of this. There are some illustrative examples of this. For example, Cubans with Spanish citizenship have had their ESTA, their electronic system for travel authorization, visa waiver to the United States, cancelled or denied.
Yeah.
Cubans residing in the European Union have been denied bank accounts or have had existing accounts frozen since their nationality makes them, quote, high risk clients. Some universities in the United States are barred from supporting research or other work by Cuban artists, writers, academics, activists, and journalists at risk who reside on the islands. Faith-based groups have had funds frozen and humanitarian supplies shipments blocked. People attempting to make a PayPal or Wise money transfer to family in Cuba may have their funds frozen and accounts locked. So, for example, if you wanted to try and send a bit of money to Cuba via PayPal, not going to happen. Your account's going to get blocked. And of course, as a result of these being associated and this issue of financial institutions being perceived to be working with a quote state sponsor of terrorism, 45 banks and financial institutions with long-standing relationships with Cuba, they've had to sever their ties now as a result of this. Again, to avoid the association with, facilitating terrorism. And this has, of course, caused devastating economic impacts. So yeah, this really isn't just some sort of academic or like philosophical matter. It has tangible, real-life harmful consequences for the people of Cuba. And here's the fucking thing, very importantly. While the embargo itself, there's like a tangled web. It's a whole mess. To get rid of that, you need the support of Congress. It's very difficult to lift that. There's a bunch of loopholes that people will have to go through to get rid of that and to unravel all of the different laws that compose the blockade, But this SST status, this state sponsor of terrorism status, could very easily be removed by Biden at basically the stroke of a pen, not even requiring congressional approval. But Biden won't do it, mainly due to pressure from right-wing Miami Cubans who still seek revenge for Cuba seizing their families' exploitative businesses from the earlier days of the puppet Batista regime. And of course, Biden is courting the support of these reactionaries, and so he won't. He doesn't want to rock the boat, So incredibly cynical, incredibly harmful, incredibly damaging, and incredible in the worst way possible.
So obviously this is like horrendous, and as something that is materially affecting the working class, we kind of have to question what our position as communists should be in regard to Cuba and this embargo, and how should we act on these positions, right? This is specifically, in this case, Paul and I are more kind of like anti-revisionist, and sometimes there's these questions of what are our positions on these actually existing socialist-like states, right? And my answer to that basically is that the embargo in Cuba is clearly a deliberate attempt to make the people of Cuba suffer in order to incite an uprising that would lead to a color revolution with the desired result of overthrowing the current government of Cuba, which the majority of Cuban people support. The Cuban citizens, of course, and placing the most anti-communist and reactionary puppet government possible that serves the imperialist interests of the U.S. and other Western capitalist imperialist class, who lost a fortune after Cuba nationalized U.S. oil refineries located on the island and no longer gave U.S. capitalists access to exploit their sugar and other desired goods. So it goes without saying this desired result would come to pass through the undemocratic and violent means of a U.S.-backed coup. At its core, this embargo is an anti-people policy. It is a deliberate war against the proletarian class in Cuba by the foreign imperialist class in the United States and the Cuban bourgeoisie, who are still foaming at the mouth with anger over their exploitative industrial businesses and plantations being seized by the Cuban Revolution, and their private lands being redistributed to the Cuban people who worked for them, right? And worked on them, tilled the land. So obviously, I feel as communist, our primary concern is advocating for the interests of the international proletariat. The Cuban proletariat is suffering greatly because of this capitalist embargo. Thus, the only principled position to have as a communist surrounding the embargo on Cuba is to demand to end it. What do you think about that, Paul?
Yeah, I definitely agree about that. I think we should talk about this question of like AES a little bit more afterwards, but I really want to emphasize again and just underline that point that you made. We need to demand an end to it. We need to demand an end to the imperialist embargo, which has cost countless lives, as well as billions upon billions of US dollars from the Cuban economy since the 1960s. I think it's something like 144 billion since the 90s, which for Cuba is a lot. For like an imperialist country, that might not be that much, but I mean, look at how much people make per month in Cuba, and then you'll see just how much that is, and how much the country could be thriving and prospering if they had that in their pockets. With that in mind, agitate, educate, organize, join up with Cuban solidarity groups in your area, get engaged in activism to highlight the brutal injustices of the US blockade on Cuba. If there aren't any solidarity groups in your area already established, then it's up to you to start putting one together. And of course, this can apply to solidarity with other movements and progressive movements and socialist movements around the world. Solidarity with like Palestine, or of course the National Democratic Movement, the movement in India, all these kinds of things. You should be engaging in all this kind of international solidarity work, because this is what we do. We take the position of proletarian internationalism. And I will say, with regard to these kinds of solidarity groups, you don't need to have perfect ideological unity to work together on issues like this. Everyone who supports ending the imperialist blockade can be worked with on this issue, regardless of their ideology. Okay, so you can have this tactical unity on this matter, regardless of whether you're just like a progressive, like a social democrat, whether you're like a Maoist or just a Marxist-Leninist or whatever. On this issue, where we are united and where we share the same goals against imperialism and protecting oppressed nations from imperialism, we come together and say, hands off.
Exactly.
And so with that, there's concrete things that you can do. It's not just about forming this solidarity group and it just being like a little club and you have like a Facebook page, doesn't be showing my age. Facebook page, Twitter, the TikTok, them TikToks for the kids. I don't know, the Snapchatties or whatever the kids are on these days.
Don't try to talk about Cuba on TikTok. You will be flooded. You will be banned. It will reach Gusano TikTok. Don't do that.
Okay, I definitely want to avoid Gusano TikTok, yeah. No, but I will say on the ground stuff, if you have a platform online, use that. If you have a platform, talk about these things, highlight these issues, and use that to your advantage, of course. Every possible means, every platform you can find, get out and educate, agitate, and organize, elevate people's consciousnesses, let people know what's going on, hold regular information styles where you live, like in your city, your town, whatever it might be. Demonstrate outside government buildings, have demonstrations, little protests. If you live outside America, you might look at like US embassies. If there's a US embassy in your country, you might be able to do a demonstration outside there, highlighting the imperialist aggression, highlighting the blockades, things like that. Of course, I have to say, check out the legal restrictions in your area, so that you don't get into any legal trouble with this. You want to keep yourselves going long term. You don't want to just get yourself locked up. Then you're no use to anybody. You're no good to anybody if you're locked up. So so make sure you don't get yourself into legal trouble doing that. Do check the rules around protesting outside embassies and see what you can do. And if you do have space to do that, then definitely look into it. Make sure that you're raising awareness of the severity of this issue everywhere and anywhere that you can. Anywhere you can find a platform, anywhere you can find a soapbox to jump on and shout at the street corner, your workplace, your friends, go anywhere you can get on and do this. Online as well is fine, because the reality is that most people outside Cuba just genuinely aren't aware of how bad this blockade actually is. They just don't know. They're just completely ignorant to this, and if possible, if you're in a position and if you do have a solidarity group, if you do manage to put one together that's successful, then maybe look into actually traveling to Cuba, with groups in solidarity. Get involved with the solidarity brigades, and then in that way you could materially support the revolution and become part of it yourself. They do little work projects over there where you get people, they help out on the farms for a couple hours a day, and they just do incredible work. There's been a long-standing tradition of groups coming over and doing that. So get involved, get out there. Agitate, educate, organize.
Yeah, and I think that one specific campaign that you can definitely get involved with is Friends of Cuba Solidarity Campaign. Especially if you're in the United States, you can be affiliated. I think despite the distance, I think they're one of the organizations that goes to Cuba. And yeah, so if you have also I know that if you're a member of CPUSA, especially I think if you're in DC, I'm not really sure about that one though. You have the opportunity at times to travel to Cuba if you have an established relationship with a Cuban embassy. I'm not part of CPUSA, right? But many activists that express solidarity with the Cuban people, they do get invited to go to Cuba and see what's going on there, do kind of some education development events, attend the May Day parade. And that's something that I would encourage everyone to do. I obviously have not done this, but I know people who have and have seen this stuff firsthand. That is definitely something that I would encourage. Otherwise, yeah, Cuba Solidarity Campaign, some nonprofits that do a lot of work on Cuba, and they have pretty good, solid campaigns on this, especially when it comes, I guess, to like lobby and stuff like that. Everyone knows how I feel about electoral politics, right? People get annoyed by that, but like genuinely kind of like trying to get people in Congress who have for years actually been against the embargo on Cuba and stuff like that. There's a plethora actually of like Democrats on the state level and on the federal level. Code Pink does a really good work on this stuff. They also do kind of like drives of like those syringes to Cuba, getting those medical supplies to Cuba. Code Pink is really good for that. So I would say, yeah, get involved in any way that you can. Of course, showing like your support through demonstrations is always good too. I would say make sure that you collaborate with, or in coalition with, or join a Cuban solidarity organization, especially ones that are very heavily established and maybe have ties to a Cuban embassy, because that's the best way that you can help the Cuban people more materially, like have that connection more thoroughly with that. So definitely agree with that. And speaking of Cuban embassy and Cuban government and state, socialist state, actually existing socialist state, question mark.
The big one.
Some people who are part of our spheres basically will ask, but isn't Cuba revisionist, right? We just talked about how as communists we have to stand in solidarity with the Cuban people, the country of Cuba, the island of Cuba, against this imperialist aggression, this embargo, this genocidal embargo, because let's be frank, right? It is purposely causing the suffering and death of people for a political gain. So why should we support this so-called actually existing socialist country like Cuba? That's something that someone might ask themselves in response to us, right? Especially like I'm part of ANF Bayan, where revolutionary socialist organization, we hold generally anti-revisionist views, right? So even though like our organization isn't communist, but there's many Marxists in it, like me, for example. I would say that communists do not support the proletariat of a country only if we believe they are socialists, right? That's never been the case. We've never only supported the proletariat just because they're socialists and only the socialist proletariat. The majority of the working masses in this world do not identify as communist, and yet as communists, we identify with the interests of the working class. That's why we stood with the people of Iraq against the Iraq invasion by the United States. Or even further back in history, that's why we stood in solidarity with the citizens of the Spanish Republic against the invading fascist hordes of Francisco Franco. We fought and died for the people of Spain, not just the communists of Spain, right? We stand in solidarity against all oppressed working class people and support the national liberation of colonized people, regardless if we agree 100% with the most popular ideology amongst the suffering masses, right? We support Armenia against Azerbaijan, right? We stand with Palestine against Zionist settler colonialism. We support the people of Yemen against the US, Saudi, UAE, UK coalition war against their country. And we stand with the workers striking in France and Senegal and South Africa, not because those suffering masses are communists, but because they are suffering under the suffocating boot of the capitalist imperialist class and their fascist and feudalist allies, right? So if we support the people and the sovereignty of non-socialist countries, I do not understand how it makes any logical sense to not support the people and the sovereignty of Cuba, right? Of course, support is always not without criticism, because we always believe as Marxists that we must criticize, we must investigate before speaking, right? There are revisionist elements in Cuba for sure, right? Which, though certainly nowhere near the main cause of the Cuban people's suffering, should be critiqued, even if we understand the context of why those revisions happened. For example, I think I talked about this earlier. Cuba resulted in the imposition of some austerity measures by the Cuban government, which were deemed necessary by the US in order for them to lift certain suffocating parts of the embargo, more suffocating parts, right? which have resulted, for example, in the creation of an increase of homelessness in Cuba for the first time since the Cuban revolutionary government was established, right? That can be true at the same time that Cuba's main class enemy, the proletariat of Cuba's main class enemy, is the capitalist imperialist class in the United States, because materially, their interests are the ones that are causing their suffering more directly, more than any kind of revisionist elements right now in Cuba. But the revisionist elements, of course, do not help at all, right? So that's why we must stand, of course, with the Cuban people. And I don't think it's effective or makes any sense as anti-revisionists for us to be shy about our support for the Cuban proletariat or Cuba's sovereignty, period, because we do not, we see their government as revisionist, or we see them, for example, during the era of like Khrushchev. We, like, some people describe it like in our circles as like a sugar colony for Cuba, right? Like for the USSR or something like that, right? That doesn't change the fact that the embargo on Cuba is the main cause of the suffering of the proletariat of Cuba, and that should be our main concern at this moment. So yeah.
You brought forward some really important points there, and I would really like to return to this question of compromises, because you mentioned how, with being removed from the state sponsor of terrorism lists, with the easing up of restrictions under Obama, there were compromises that had to be made. There were austerity measures that were brought in, private property.
And even before that, in order to like facilitate that in the future, right? Like I believe it started like in the 90s or something like that with tourism or something. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. And then just 2021, of course, you saw the opening up of space for small businesses and private property building, and the building of more petty bourgeois forces. And I want to return to this question of compromises, because there is a tendency to, especially if you're sort of anti-revisionist oriented, if you're MLM oriented, we can just reject all compromises. And I do want to return to that in a moment. But just to frame this question a little bit better, Cuba is under a genocidal embargo. We can talk about revisionism in the Communist Party of Cuba, in the PCC. We can talk about revisionism there. Yeah. I don't hear people having that same conversation about revisionism in the PFLP in Palestine, or the PLO, or any of these things. No, it's just accepted that we support Palestine in their struggle against imperialist aggression, or, Israeli colonialism, and working as a satellite state for Western imperialism, So there's an interesting double standard that's going on there. People can very clearly see it when there's a more active struggle, like colonial aggression happening right now, or when there's no pretenses that the struggle engaged in is some kind of struggle for socialism, then we seem to be much more easily able to lend our support to that on that basis. Like, for example, I've seen people like Maoists and the most principled anti-revisionists give like utmost full uncritical support to like the Irish Republican Army and things like that, even though there were never any pretenses that was like a Marxist-Leninist Maoist force. There were, of course, socialist elements, but there was also, from a scientific socialist perspective, there are criticisms that need to be made of that movement as well. And so on this basis against imperialism, I think that's where we need to focus primarily. The principal contradiction in the world today is between imperialism and the oppressed nations. Now, regardless of whether we think that Cuba is in the socialist transitional stage or it's just like a social democracy, it's our duty primarily to support Cuba as an oppressed nation against imperialist aggression. This support isn't, as you say, without criticism, critical of errors, and we mentioned earlier on, for example, like Fidel mourning for Franco and things like this, and we can be critical as well.
Uncommon Fidel L. That was crazy. When I found that out, I was like, what? Because, okay, not to interrupt you for a second, okay? Not to interrupt you for a second, but like their policy was weird because, okay, obviously, like, my stance on this, especially coming from an anti-revisionist like sense, it's like, really, this sucks ass, right? Like, fuck him for doing that shit, because that's insane, right? Because Franco was horrendous towards like communists, towards national liberation movement. He had a very he even was like, he had a white supremacist ideology as well. Like, this man was not great, right? Like, he was a Catholic zealot. He sucked ass, okay? And it was weird because the Cuban government also, like the revolutionary government, offered asylum for like Republicans, like Spanish Republicans and stuff like that, who had been bouncing around from country to country, right? And the reason why Franco and Cuba had and Fidel, I guess, had a not amicable relationship, I think it was more economic, is because Spain was the only country that like would still trade with them, right? Like that wasn't part of the socialist bloc. Yeah. One of the only countries, okay, because they wanted Cuban goods, right? Like they wanted like a bunch of stuff that, like, for example, like a lot of the plantation owners in Spain from like Spanish descent and stuff like that, or you know, like Spanish businesses like had in Cuba, right? Because they still kind of survived even after the Spanish-American War there, right? Like the families from there. For example, Bacardi, right? Bacardi was a Catalan family. And they like set up shop in Cuba. That's like where they were stationed at and stuff like that. Stationed, LOL. You know, that's where they had their plantation for Bacardi there. But like they were still be able to like import these like goods into Spain, and that kind of to this day still really helps Cuba in some way. But at the same time, it's like it also gave some leniency, I guess, towards Spanish businessmen in revolutionary Cuba, which is a bad thing. And it gave kind of like headquarters to like right-wing newspapers from Spain and Cuba, which ultimately hurt the Cuban Revolution as well. So like that's like a major kind of like critique that I have of the revolutionary Cuban government. Once again, I can understand why those revisions were put in place. Not revisions, but I guess like anti-people like policies just in general, having a relationship with Franco's Spain, stuff like that. It's because, I mean, it's one of the only countries that would trade with Cuba, you know? Like, and they were under a suffocating blockade, right? And like, so I get that, you know? But at the same time, yeah, like definitely criticism.
It's
still shit.
But as long as we understand, as long as we understand like why, like what the circumstances were that led to that, I think you can kind of understand.
And the question is that the fault of the Cuban proletariat? Should I then, because I'm a Spaniard, right, a Spanish communist, like that is against Franco and stuff like that, does that mean that now I should be not talking about the Cuban embargo? You know, like, does that mean that I should not be against the embargo against Cuba, which is hurting the Cuban proletariat that seeks to kind of like force them to be desperate enough to overthrow their government, to impose a puppet regime for the United States, which is going to make the Cuban people suffer even more because they will choose the most reactionary, the most anti-communist, the most fascistic puppet so that American businesses can come back and Spanish businesses can come back full force on the island and steal everything that the revolutionary government was able to give the Cuban masses to make their lives significantly better. That's why they overwhelmingly support the revolutionary government. No, right? Like there's like this thing where it's like you can say, for example, yes, that was wrong, that was like stupid, that's so dumb, we should have never, like they should have never done that, and like that causes some mistrust, right? But that doesn't mean that we have to take that out. We can't have this bourgeois mindset of like, because the government of this socialist country, right, like this country had a relationship with Franco, now I'm not going to stand with the proletariat of that country, right? It's not internationalist. It's bourgeois-minded. I think it's like very self-centered. That's my opinion.
No, I would generally agree with that. We still stand with the Cuban people, absolutely. You know, so primarily that has to be it. So our support is primary and our criticism is secondary. You know, so we may have criticisms of, you know, elements of revisionism and here and that and the other, but first and foremost, hands off Cuba. You know,
Cuba, yeah,
and
number one thing.
Exactly, yeah, and you know, and I think with that in mind, it is important to understand the correct time and place for these criticisms. You know, you need to make sure that if you're going to have these criticisms, you need to couch that within the principled support first and foremost. And I would say it's probably more useful to have, it's more fruitful to have conversations, criticisms of revisionist elements within smaller groups, within closed groups, within like reading groups where you discuss texts. You know, you discuss, for example, the RCP's evaporation of a myth. You discuss burn down the cane fields, all of these texts. You dive into them, you explore them. You say, is this correct? Is this not correct? And you work through them together in those smaller groups. It's not necessarily the best thing to be going out and projecting that first and foremost. Just being like, go fuck them, overthrow the Cuban government right now. That's not fucking useful.
Yeah.
Even if you had a perfect MLM party leading Cuba at the moment, even if you had that perfect party, the embargo would still fucking exist. The embargo is still causing all of these problems. Not that much would change. People would be like, oh, well, they would move more towards self-sufficiency. And to that, I have to say, where's the example? Where's the proof? Where's this happened in a small country that has been so dependent historically? Where has this self-sufficiency actually worked? They might say, oh, well, Hoxha's Albania, once they turned away from, China and the USSR after the split and so on. And how long did that last? How long did Albania last before turning to revisionism?
Not long.
No, by the end of the 70s, they had succumbed to revisionism, and they were on the capitalist road, and it evaporated. The DPRK, of course, which is very much committed to self-sufficiency, is still massively dependent on imports and exports from China. Now today, it suffered tremendously in the 1990s after its major trading ally in the USSR, the Soviet Union, fell, and now China has stepped up to become that trading partner. So self-sufficiency. I'm sorry, if you're not from a small country, you might not understand how difficult that is to bring about within these countries. You can understand how that might be a little bit of a pipe dream until we've actually seen it work in practice sustainably for a long period of time. So, these are just questions that have to be asked, and particularly with regard to self-sufficiency. Everybody wants to be self-sufficient. I want a self-sufficient Ireland, but shit. We have a proletarian revolution tomorrow. That's not going to happen. That's not realistically going to happen. We don't have the resources to make that happen. I don't know if it would happen in the Philippines either. You still need allies and partners to work with and trade with. We live in a world of global supply chains. Those need to be taken over by worker states, by proletarian working class forces who can then cooperate on a proletarian international basis and move towards the socialist mode of production. But we're not there yet.
Yeah, and especially, I guess, like in islands like Ireland, like Cuba, like the Philippines, especially in the Philippines, since it's like an archipelago of different islands, right? Like we have to, self-sufficiency is a process, right? Just like a socialist project is an ongoing project, right? For example, even under the revolutionary kind of leadership of Chairman Mao, right? In China, it was an ongoing project, right? They had to do a bunch of, they had to industrialize to try to be more self-sufficient. They had to go through this process, right? And they still dealt with food insufficiency to the point that they had a famine, right? And that's not without lack of trying, because they did try to not have that happen. And, their efforts at the end, they did pay off, because that's the last famine that happened there, right? But at the end of the day, it's it takes a while, right? If you're trying to, especially in Cuba, where they were a sugar plantation colony. That's what they were. That was the majority of their economy, was sugar plantation, right?
But
and
U.S.
also
American,
tourism,
but U.S.
right?
Americans,
By U.S.
of course,
Americans,
who owned all of these. They were the dominant owners of these plantations. And then, of course, the Cuban government comes in and nationalizes all of these.
Yeah, in the 1960s, till the 1960s, that was their economy, right? So, how are you supposed to turn from we had to make the majority of our food, the majority of the labor that we put into growing shit was growing sugar to be exported, and the majority of the food that we would eat would be imported, just like in the Philippines, where we export a massive amount of rice. I think we're one of the largest exporters of rice, right? But Filipinos in the Philippines don't eat rice from the Philippines, right? They eat rice from Thailand, Japan, all these people, these places, and it's imported, right? So if, for example, the Philippines were to become socialist today, right, they would have to build up those industries. And so Cuba has been trying to build up those industries, and I would say they've done it fairly well, I think, under their certain conditions, and those conditions are literally suffocating, and a suffocating embargo, right? So it's kind of I don't know, it's just, you have to take that nuance into head, right? Self-sufficiency is what we want, but that's a process. It does not happen as soon as you turn socialist, right? And Cuba, for example, has been under blockade during this kind of process. So it's been slowed down purposely. So, yeah.
I think this is kind of what I wanted to get at, because when we demand self-sufficiency, like immediately, like that's a possibility right now. This is getting beyond what's possible in the moment. That wasn't on the menu. That
Yeah.
couldn't have happened. You know, looking at the geography, looking at understanding the lack of resources, the natural resources within Cuba, building a fully self-sufficient economy, that was always going to be massively difficult. It's not like China or Russia or these
Absolutely, yeah.
massive countries which have access to basically everything that they will need. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be a lot of work, but they can become self-sufficient, and they made incredible moves in that direction, and had even achieved it at certain points. But with a small island country like this, it's understandable. You can understand why they ended up reverting to a nationalized sugar industry, you know, so they nationalized
Yeah.
all of these former sugar plantations. And by the way, I also want to say on the word plantation, people who are listening to this from the US, they're probably thinking like slave plantation. That's not what it means. When we say plantation, we're literally just talking about like the patches of land, you know. It's not actually slaves in general.
There
It's
wasn't
not
really,
like,
but they were just very underpaid at that point.
yeah,
But,
there
like,
was there was definitely a lot of that, but under Batista, like they didn't actually have a slave
yeah,
society.
they didn't
which
have slavery. Yes,
It's not literal
Yeah.
slave. Okay, wage slavery, yada yada yada. Okay, but it's just
Yeah,
it is
yeah.
important. It just is important because people are thinking like U.S. plantations and cotton and all
Yeah.
this shit, and it's not exactly the same thing. So it's just
Yeah.
important to underline that as we have this conversation. You know, but I think that they made some really important developments, and they did what they could within the difficult situations, and they had to make compromises. You know, they had to look at what was possible, and they had to see, you know, what can we do. And as we know, from a comparative advantage perspective, they were able to see that we could get a lot more money from sugar. The USSR was paying way above market rate for all this sugar for them. And so it was kind of like a good deal for them to keep doing this, you know. So, you know, you have to keep these things in mind, guys. You really have to. It's nice. It's all well and good to sit back in the armchair and to pontificate and to go on about how you would have done this and you would have done that and everything would have been perfect. And yeah, okay, live in a revolution and understand how messy it is. Things are not always what you want them to be. And this idea of like no compromises, guys, you have to go back to Lenin. You have to read left-wing communism, a quote, infantile disorder. As I said, I don't like really saying that. It sounds a little bit ableisty, a little bit funky, but I do want to read out a little passage from this that might help contextualize the kinds of compromises that have to be made in any revolutionary process. Lenin spoke very, very openly about this. I'm just going to put it up on the screen. Again, Anna, you won't be able to see it, but
it's okay. Narrate to me. I love listening to Lenin. Please.
Well, it's a long one, so hopefully.
Also, Lenin had an Irish accent when he was speaking in English, so this is like authentic.
He did, yeah. But Lenin had a much more upper class, bougie Irish accent. But anyway,
damn.
Yeah, so just on this point on like compromises, Lenin spoke a lot about this because when he called this an infantile disorder, it sounds really inflammatory, but no, it's about understanding that this is part of the process of developing as a socialist. You realize revisionism is a thing, and then you go to left opportunist positions as an overcorrection for that revisionism that you see, and you start demanding the impossible. And then anything that's not perfect, that doesn't perfectly fit this preconceived notion of the ideal pure socialist experience, then that's not good enough. You know, good becomes the enemy of perfect, and you're never gonna see a successful revolution if that's the way you see it. So Lenin talked about this a little bit. Here we go. Imagine that your car is held up by armed bandits. Imagine you have a car. You hand them over your money, passport, revolver, and car. Again, we just all have those things. Really speaking to the workers. In return for handing these over, you are rid of the pleasant company of the bandits. That is unquestionably a compromise. I give you money, firearms, and a car so that you give me the opportunity to get away from you with a whole skin. It would, however, be difficult to find a sane man who would declare such a compromise to be, quote, inadmissible on principle, or who would call the compromiser an accomplice of the bandits, even though the bandits might use the car and firearms for further robberies. So keep that in mind. He then he goes on a little bit further. I'm jumping a paragraph, but you can check this out on Left-Wing Communism if you want. The conclusion is clear. To reject compromises, quote, on principle, to reject the permissibility of compromises in general, no matter of what kind, is childishness. which it is difficult even to consider seriously. A political leader who desires to be useful to the revolutionary proletariat must be able to distinguish concrete cases of compromises that are inexcusable and are an expression of opportunism and treachery. He must direct all the force of criticism, the full intensity of merciless exposure and relentless war against these concrete compromises, and not allow the past masters of practical socialism and parliamentary Jesuits to dodge and wriggle out of the responsibility by means of disquisitions on compromises in general. So again, he's emphasizing that there are different forms of compromises, necessary compromises and opportunist compromises. He carries on at the end here. There are different kinds of compromises. One must be able to analyze the situation and the concrete conditions of each compromise, or of each variety of compromise. One must learn to distinguish between a man who has given up his money and firearms to bandits so as to lessen the evil they can do and to facilitate their capture and execution, and a man who has given his money and firearms to bandits so as to share in the loot. Okay, so one of them is getting away.
He ate.
He cooked. So I think this is just a really, really interesting example. And, he goes on, he talks about how this is a ridiculous, childish example, but it gets to the heart of it, because in one of these cases, you're doing it to get away with your life, to survive, to live, to see another day. In the other case, you're actually helping out the bandits because the bandits helping you out and you're getting to share the loot. You're participating in it, So, and I don't want you to. I don't want you to give like an answer to this question necessarily right now. Although if you want to, you can feel free. With these words in mind, I think it's worth asking: is Cuba making these compromises, such as those that you've discussed? Austerity, introducing petty bourgeois forms of private property. Is Cuba making these compromises in order to simply survive under such intense imperialist aggression? Or are they making these compromises to themselves, quote, share in the loot of imperialist plunder? So which is it? Is this to survive under the blockade, under such intense imperialist aggression? Or are they getting a cut of imperialist plunder by doing this? So that's a question I'm going to leave pretty much open to people. I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on it, if you have any thoughts on this passage in general, but I think it's definitely something that we need to consider. Everybody watching this, perhaps you're coming from the anti-revisionist perspective. Perhaps you're coming from the perspective of someone who doesn't even acknowledge that these are compromises and potential capitulations to capital. Maybe you're someone who just sticks their fingers in their ears and says, la, 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 la. Cuba's still traveling a straight line to socialism, which, Lenin, of course, said is ridiculous. There is no straight line from capitalism to socialism. No, it's an ascending zigzag with setbacks and launches forward, and it doesn't just proceed in a nice forward straight line, So yeah, I thought that was an interesting paragraph. What did you think?
I personally, well, first of all, I love reading Lenin because he is so sassy. I love him. He's like, so say you got a car. Like, I love him for that. But
pleasant company of bandits.
Basically what I'm thinking, like myself, for example, I can acknowledge that I don't have enough investigation on this topic and the compromises that Cuba makes to have a right to speak. I think, from what I know, a lot of their compromises are for survival. I don't know if it's accurate to say that all of them are for survival, but I also can't ascertain that there is any that aren't, right? So, and that's kind of principled as well. It's this position of taking the stance of recognizing that you don't know something, right? You don't know. I don't know. For example, I can make the admission, I haven't been to Cuba, right? Like, I haven't been to Cuba. I don't participate as much as I would like to, for example, in these Cuba solidarity organizations, even though I personally stand in solidarity. I have many comrades who have gone to Cuba. And I myself, as I described, I'm very much against the Cuban embargo because it was just genocidal nature, and I stand in solidarity with the Cuban proletariat. But I would not, for example, speak on something that I don't know. And I feel like we have a tendency on the online left, at least from what I've seen on Twitter. I think Paul and I are good at avoiding this, but there's some people that don't avoid this, right? That either say completely like any criticism of Cuba is fed shit, like immediately, like there's nothing that like is wrong with this, blah blah blah. Or you go the other way, that's like Cuba isn't even socialist, everyone who supports Cuba is pro-capitalist, everyone like
Yeah.
Cuba is a has betrayed the proletariat, Cuba, blah 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 blah, right? So I think that we have to be more scientific, as Lenin says, like in this, like being ultimately knowing when a good compromise is a compromise that is like for the good of the people, is having a scientific approach in understanding revolution than having an idealist one, right? Because at the end of the day, ultra-leftism is idealism, right? Because it's not scientific to have kind of like the expectations, knowing the material conditions of this world that all ultra leftists have of every single socialist project ever, whether or not we consider that it was upholding the correct path, or that we consider that it's revisionist, right? So yeah, that's my thoughts on that. I love Lenin and the way that he's able to express things, because he is a king. I need to read the rest of that.
Oh, it's so good. I'd read it many years ago, but I revisited it again recently, and particularly like in preparation for this, when I've been going through the documents and a lot of the anti-revisionist documents as well, and it just got my head scratching. It just got cogs turned in my head, and I was like, okay, there's more to this. We need to be more dialectical. We need to look at the different sides. The arguments for, against.
Mm-hmm.
We need to look at concretely, like what was potentially sharing in the loot, as we say, and what was potentially for survival, and be more concrete about that, and be able to distinguish and delineate between these two different forms of compromises that occur. So yeah, there's a lot more there, and I don't think that we need to give to wrap this up and to to give a conclusive answer, but to put the questions out there and to get comrades thinking about them. And of course, people can engage with this further. If people want to discuss it in the comments below, we can definitely engage with those. We can have a little chat about it afterwards. If you have great sources, of course, the classic anti-revisionist sources will be Burn Down the Cane Fields, part 1 and 2, and then the RCP USA's Evaporation of a Myth. They'd be the classic anti-revisionist ones. There's tons of ML, like pro Cuba ML stuff out there, and people can just leave comments below. They can leave little links, making their case for what they think was necessary and what was maybe going a little bit too far. And I think it'd be a good conversation to have. I think there's a lot more. I think we need to go further than just uncritical dogmatic support, as you said. Like, how dare you question anything Cuba has ever done? You must be a Fed, and also throwing out the entire revolution as just being revisionist, betrayal, traitors to the socialist cause. They were reactionaries. They just became, basically Fidel was just like a new Batista 2.0 or something ridiculous like that, So I think there's a lot more to it, and I think we need to have a more nuanced and dialectical perspective on the matter.
Period. Totally agree. In conclusion, lift the embargo on Cuba.
Yes! Principally solidarity, secondarily crit.
Period.
All right, Anna, thank you so much for doing this. Not stream. What do we call this? Just a recording, I suppose.
Pod.
Pod. Streamcast.
Episode.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for doing this as well. I think that I'm really excited to continue doing this, and I think that we're excited to hear what people have to say about this. Any criticisms, any comments, make sure to share this. Make sure to support the cause for lifting the embargo on Cuba, and get involved on the grassroots level and in any level that you can in the movement in support of the Cuban proletariat.
Definitely. Whatever you can do, do it. In your situation, in your circumstances, do the best you can. That's all anyone can ask from you.
Exactly.
All right, folks. Thanks so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed this, and we'll be back soon. The next one, are we gonna, Anna? Should we spoil it? Should we spoil what the next stream is going to be about and who it's with?
Must we? Yes, let's do it. Let's
You
do
want to
it.
say? You want to say, or will I?
Yes. We're having a gay stream and we're having it with Black Red Guard.
Epic. It's gonna be great. It's gonna be great. Yeah, I think it'll be next Tuesday.
Let's go. Yes, next Tuesday. I'm so excited. I'm so excited because I love their content so much, and we're mutes, and I know we're gonna have such a good time, and we're gonna talk about like being queer as well, like in the communist movement, and like the history of that relationship, as well as like how queerphobia like is tied to like feudalism, all that good stuff. So you gotta go check it out. You gotta come on there and talk about it. I will shout out Bahakari. So yeah, please join us. It's gonna be so fun. I'm so excited. This is my favorite one yet.
I am so excited for this, and I'm certain my internet won't be working again for this, unfortunately, but hopefully we can do it live. Hopefully we'll try our best to do it live. If not, we'll have to do like an episode like this again, but we'll try to do it live. We'll try to have some Q&A. I know Black Redguard sometimes doesn't do Q&As. I know he turns off the comments on some of his videos, so maybe we can convince him to answer the people's questions.
You know what? I respect him for that. It's okay. That's all right.
He's not dealing with the bullshit. Yeah.
No further questions.
That is going to be a ton of fun. So really, really looking forward to that. That's going to be great. Really excited about that. We're going to be talking about, as you said, the links to feudalism. We're going to be talking about the division in the queer liberation movement between the radicals who really see queer emancipation as being a criticism, a critique of patriarchal society and social norms on one hand, and then on the other hand, assimilationists, people who basically just want to assimilate to the bourgeois nuclear family unit and just fulfill the same gender roles within that, and also to address questions about, like, for example, have we potentially seceded some terrain with regard to the queer liberation struggle? Is that now being led by capitalists, or are socialists still at the forefront fighting for these struggles as socialists have been historically? So I think some interesting questions to have there, and it's going to be good. It's going to be a lot of fun. So thanks for watching. Gurmila Mahagwiv, Slán go fóill, all the best.
Adios, bye.